Hello there, you're watching Sky News and the Press Preview. In the next half an hour, we're going to be seeing what's making the headlines with the historian and author Kate Williams and the PR consultant Alex Deane. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
Hello. So let's check on the front pages then. And The Times has an interview with Libya's Prime Minister, who tells the paper Europe is increasingly at risk from terrorists posing as migrants. The Eye says the Defence Secretary Michael Fallon supports President Trump's decision to increase US forces in Afghanistan. The Metro leads with Prince Harry's defence of his father over the breakup of his marriage with Princess Diana in a new documentary. The Mirror has more on the Prince's reaction to the anniversary of their mother's death, with Harry and his brother William speaking about how they felt when they found out. That's also the lead for the Daily Mail, which says the princes were shocked at the scale of public mourning. The FT leads with consumer finance company Provident Financial losing 2/3 of its market value. The Daily Telegraph says the government's latest positioning paper on Brexit suggests that the UK could be bound by the decisions of the European Court of Justice when it leaves the EU. And The Sun reports on a British man who was arrested in Turkey after he found some historical coins whilst snorkelling. So lots of different stories there on the front pages, lots to discuss with Kate Williams and Alex Deane. And the one you've picked to kick off with is the Eye's front page. And this is after Donald Trump's announcement in the middle of our time last night, that instead of pulling out of Afghanistan, which he'd pledged on the campaign trail, he was going to recommit to the country. And this has got a little bit about Britain's reaction as well.
Of course, Donald Trump's campaign was very much about defining himself outside the mainstream and being different from what happened politically hitherto. And much of his time in government, putting aside some of the noise, has been returning to the mainstream. And this is a mainstream policy position, as demonstrated by the fact that it's our Defence Secretary endorsing his position on the front of one of our national newspapers. It is right, I think, that Trump continues the attempt to defeat the Taliban in Afghanistan. But to be clear, it's definitely not what he said he would do when he was campaigning for the presidency. He, in fact, committed to do the reverse.
He said it was a total disaster, I believe, during his campaign. And certainly, I think part of this rather surprising policy that's going to surprise a lot of observers is partly due to internal White House politics. We know that Steve Bannon, who was there, didn't want more than what they had. I mean, I think the current number of American soldiers in Afghanistan is 8,400. Bannon wanted it to stay as that. He is no longer there, and Trump has decided that he's listening to his generals, thinking that the suggestion that ISIS can be contained, ISIS can be captured. And this is the big question, which none of us can predict, but on the basis of past experience, the problematic question is, can this war be won? Because what you feel about the fact that it's been going on since 2001, and it's been a war that no one could win whatsoever, and things are getting, you might say, worse.
Well, that's right. 8,400 troops is a lot less than they have been at their height. And even then, they didn't manage to solve some of the issues in Afghanistan. So is it right, do you think, to commit more troops and to...
Well, I do think it is. And it was Colin Powell, a different context, but still relevant, who said, if you break it, you own it. And whilst it wasn't Donald Trump who led America when the intervention in Afghanistan happened. I mean, it's been with us for a generation now, 16 years of activity in this country. Nevertheless, I think it's America's moral duty to support the government that it has basically created. The government in Afghanistan is a creation of international will. It's not one that would survive if merely left on its own. And whilst it may seem, well, it doesn't just seem like we've been there a long time, the West has been there a long time, it's still right that that support is given.
Is it not just a moral imperative? Is Trump not pitching it as a sort of practical solution, or at least a way of stopping the rise potentially of terrorism? Because it's not just the Taliban, it's IS, as you alluded to, it's also Al-Qaeda as well. And he would say that the focus needs to be on preventing a vacuum where those kind of ideas can flourish.
Well, this is the question. Is further activity by American troops, is that going to secure the country? Is that going to stop the vacuum? Or is that going to create more problems? Because more civilians will get killed, whatever happens. There'll be bombing, people will get killed, they'll lose their homes. Is this going to create more resentment, more radicalisation? And one argument in the Telegraph today, I was reading in the Insight, it was saying that the National Security Advisor, Mr. McMaster, he was talking to Trump Trump about what Afghanistan once upon a time was, showed him pictures of him in Afghanistan in the 70s. The sort of mockery here was it showed him pictures of women in miniskirts. But the overall point was Afghanistan can't go back to how it was in the 70s. Yes, there were women in Western dress walking down the street. It's a different country, it's a different world. And so what needs to happen, one of the huge problems in 2001, among many other things, was the fact that there was a lack of intelligence, a lack of knowledge across the board, CIA, civil service, even in the army, about Afghanistan. If they're going back in, it needs serious planning and serious intelligence. And I'm concerned that once more America is going to be stuck in another miry war. And the minute American troops start coming back in body bags, the public mood is going to change.
Well,
this is an inside spread. Just to say, I've moved on to an inside spread in the Mail. We should move on in a moment. Just a quick word on what Max Hastings is saying. He's suggesting that no British soldiers should be sent out there.
Yeah, and I think he's wrong. I think that we are committed alongside our ally in this venture, and that we ought properly to see it through. It is as much in our interest that the Taliban is defeated as it is in the interest of the Americans. But whilst I don't disagree with Kate, that you're right, of course, Afghanistan is a different country to the country that it was in the 1970s. But nevertheless, there is a truth to the point that this Wahhabist lunatic sect that is taking over more and more of Islam is profoundly different from the moderate Islam that was far more prevalent 40, 50 years ago, and that we should note that and think about its historical importance. I'm glad that people are talking about that and thinking about it.
OK, I'm going to crack on because we've got lots to get on with, and you wanted to talk about the main story on the front of the Financial Times.
Yeah. Really shocking story about what's happened to Provident Financial and indeed their hitherto well-regarded Chief Executive, Peter Crook, who, full disclosure, I've met a couple of times, and I think Provi has probably been a client of my business at some point, although they're not now. Two-thirds loss wiped off their value in a single day. This is exceptionally unusual for a FTSE 100 business. They've been on the FTSE 100 for a couple of years, and for those who don't know, they're a door-to-door lending business, and traditionally they were not particularly well regarded in the market, but in more recent times, as payday lending has become increasingly prevalent, they've been seen as less bad routes to alternative financing. But their restructuring attempt to move from a model of having independent agents to having employed people seems to have gone disastrously wrong. Two-thirds value lost, and whatever you think of their business, there are many funds and there will be many people who are invested in Provident Financial for whom this is terrible news.
OK, I'm going to move on if that's all right, unless you've got something you're
nope,
burning to say about
Let's
this.
move.
Just so if we can try and get
got so much.
Fairly big story in before the break, and this is picked up in the Times. I think it's also on the front page of the Telegraph as well. May drops pledge to cut ties with European Court. It's being interpreted slightly differently depending on which paper you read, but what's at the nub of this?
Well, in January, Mrs May said she's going to take back control of our laws, leave the ECJ, it was all going to be over. But really, as a Conservative MP who's been quoted in the press has said, reality bites now. It's much more complex. It's going to be impossible, really, to do. And essentially, there's a much more softening of the position, saying that the ECJ will not have direct jurisdiction, but there will be an interaction, and there will be this interaction past the possible transition period. So, as the Times says here, what it does is it paves the way for Britain to be like somewhere like Norway, takes the European laws and court judgment, and has access to the single market. So, in the end, this is the big question that we're still debating since January. Sophie Ridge asked the Prime Minister, are we leaving the single market or not? What's the most important? This enables more access to the single market than it does. And this is the overall question we have on Brexit. Last night on Sky Papers, Carol Malone was saying no one told us Brexit was going to be this complicated, this drawn out, and it is incredibly complicated. We're having a knowledge, a recognition about how interwoven we are with all these institutions, and it's simply hard Brexit, taking back control, just leaving, it isn't that easy.
Is this a useful compromise, do you think, to allow Britain to get the best access it can to the single market, do you think, or will it just upset?
I'm not sure it's being portrayed wholly accurately. I don't mean by Kate, I mean in the commentary that we're seeing here. The courts used by our neighbours, with whom we'll continue to trade a great deal, was always going to remain persuasive in our courts, and it was always likely that we would have to find some form of method of arbitrating and ruling over disputes. whether it be the EFTA court or something else. So actually, it was never this binary, oh, Theresa May said we were going to be a way out of the ECJ entirely and now we're not going to be. It was always going to have some form of persuasive force in our courts. The important thing is, and it's a word that Kate doesn't seem to like, but the reversion of control to our country and the ability to make decisions was first and foremost about things like freedom of movement. And once you make the red lines that we have as a country decided upon, like freedom of movement, then you do leave the single market, and we are going to leave the single market. People keep talking in fuzzy terms on this programme and elsewhere about access to the single market. Everyone has access to the single market. You know, the Chinese aren't in the EU, but they manage to trade with the EU. You don't have to be under the auspices of the ECJ or even regard its judgments as persuasive in order to have that trade. That's why I think people should be a little more precise in the kind of terminology they use.
OK. Out with the fuzzy language. I'll take note. We're going to take a break. Lots more to talk about after the break, including Silicon Valley's sexist robots. That's coming up. Welcome back to the press preview, where we're taking a look at the papers with the historian and author Kate Williams and the PR consultant Alex Deane. So we're going to turn our attention to the front page of The Sun, and their headline is "Snorkel Dad in Turkish Hell Jail for Finding a Few Coins." There's not very much text on that front page, but it essentially appears that this person has, according to this copy, been arrested after finding a few coins when he was snorkelling. So it does raise the issue of, if you do find any artefacts, what is the law? I don't know what the law is here.
Well, this gentleman was snorkelling in Turkey near Bodrum, the seaside resort there, and he found some old coins and put them in his luggage. And they
not that he just found them. He then tried to take them away.
Then they were found in
Apparently.
his bag, and he is now in jail, which is obviously, we wish him all the best. But this is the bigger question. You find some coins, you're just snorkelling, these are old coins, and it does feel like it's finders keepers. But in the majority of the world, including here, you have to report your find to the authorities. So if you were to find a load of Roman coins here, you should report it to the authorities.
Well, that's right, because you do hear about extraordinary cases of people digging up their turnips.
Hoards of gold and
finding
extraordinary
finds.
I did a fantastic one. Someone who'd found a gold torque in a bog in Northern Ireland. Absolutely incredible find from the Bronze Age. And at least you would think that everything has been found, but there are many things that aren't. But I think this is a warning, really, to all of us that if you find something, we should on your holidays.
OK, I'm duly warned. Let's move on to a story inside The Times that you've picked out. And this is about robots. It's down here. Silicon Valley's home help robots trained to be sexists.
Well, it's interesting because every robot expert you talk to says that all of our jobs will be, at least half of our jobs will be robotised in 2032, that we are in denial of this, and in Silicon Valley they know what's going on. Who knows about the truth of that? But this is the interesting question about, I think they are expecting here a huge amount of demand for domestic robots, cleaning robots, cooking robots. I believe there's already some kind of little robot vacuum that can go around your house and plug it into a plug itself in whenever it feels like it, whenever it needs it. A magic, well, not if you've got a messy house like mine, and would fall over. So it's saying that there's a demand for home domestic robots, and quite apart from the question of the bigger question that we have of universal income, what's going to happen to the economy if no one's paying for domestic work anymore. This is saying that the mindsets of these domestic robots is going to be programmed by the programmers, and therefore it is all their kind of vision of what the right domestic work is going to be that comes down, so that a man will be offered a cold beer by a robot and the wife will be offered assistance with the washing up.
I'm glad Kate explained that. A couple of years ago, you and I did a story about a female panda that faked pregnancy in order to get more cake. And I felt there was basically no safe comment for a man to make. And I feel pretty similar here, I've got to tell you.
Well, robots faking for pregnancy for cake.
But presumably, these robots adapt their behaviour to the household they're in. So if you have a sexist robot, it's probably because you're in a sexist household, right?
I mean, it is very concerning when you hear that in if this is correct, that in 20 years' time, many of our jobs will simply not be around anymore. Yes, there's the argument that we always find
as
new
much
jobs.
on the surgery end as it is on the domestic chores
surgery,
end.
driving. That they say that the ones least likely to be eaten up by robots are vicar, psychologist, and novelist. But I do think there might be quite an interest in
robots writing stories.
Robot writing novels. So it is something that at some point our governments are going to have to deal with. There's much job creation, making America great again, manufacturing. We are at one point going to have to see that maybe the service jobs are the ones that are under threat.
That's one of the biggest threats. Let's move on to another story inside the Times, if I can call it up. My iPad here seems to have crashed. I will just reboot it. But it's about the surplus, £200 million surplus. It's inside the Times. And I'm sure you can tell us about it while I find it.
Well, we were expecting to borrow more in the last month, but because, not least, VAT receipts for the government have gone up, which indicate confidence in consumer spending, notwithstanding the lag in wages and a bit of tightening recently, supposedly, in what people were spending. We're still spending more on the high street and in VAT, but also in self-assessed tax receipts. So the government got a lot more in than it was expecting, and that means that Philip Hammond's probably got a bit more room to manoeuvre going into the back half of the year, and it's a very good sign for the government. But let's not get this out of proportion. We are still going to be borrowing more than £40 billion a year just to keep the show on the road. That's not exceptional expenditure, that's just underpinning and paying for the everyday. That's a major government department. So what we mustn't do is let the fact that we've had a blip and had run a surplus for a single month for the first time in ages make us think that everything is rosy. It's not.
However, the suggestion here that an easing of austerity might be possible, at least.
This is going to be definitely so. I mean, you might also argue that the great message of the election was that the austerity isn't working. People are voting against austerity, and that so we're getting a rise in tax receipts, even though we have the austerity policies are weakening. And this is actually very much an argument against austerity, but certainly also an argument for self-employed tax receipts as well. That Philip Hammond was obviously thinking of greater taxes on self-employed. There was a lot of resistance against that. Clearly, many of us in this country are self-employed and producing good income for the country. But yes, we have a country who's got a huge deficit, and we need to try and close the gap.
Now, in the last hour, I suggested that there was a black pet fox that wasn't a pet.
Pregnancy for cake?
Even bigger than that. So the big story from the Daily Mail is that there was an animal that they thought was a fox and turned out was a fox, but looked like it was wild, but in fact wasn't, and was missing, but is now home.
It's called Wilf. It's called Wilf.
It is, and I mean, in a great disappointment to all readers of newspapers, they haven't named the canine pal with whom he's pictured. I mean, what's happened to newspapers of record these days? Wilf went for a walk, saw a milkman and went home. That is the story that the Daily Mail has run over 3 columns.
Wilf is a black fox.
Wilf is a
pet.
And very rare.
Silver fox,
very
even
rare.
though he's black.
He's very rare, and so the gentleman who saw him thought he'd seen this amazing, fantastic animal that was really exciting, but unfortunately, Wilf was just an escaped pet.
And is indeed back home.
I think I get the story now. Finally, the black silver fox that is a pet.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Not pregnant.
And tried to board the
cake.
milk float because he wanted to go home.
Now that I understand, we can leave it there. Thank you both very much.
Thanks for having
Lovely
us.
to see you.
Thank you.